Welcome back. Today we're going to look at more of a big picture issue of evolution. We've looked a lot at the details of the mechanisms of change and the processes of change and natural versus sexual selection and speciation, a lot of these important issues. Today we're going to look at much more of a big picture issue of evolution over eons of time and the evidence for what is the history of life. How has the history of life unfolded? Now, I've included it here in chapter 14. Your book kind of has this information scattered out between chapters 13, 14, and 15, but I wanted to put it all in one cohesive place here. And last time we said if I'm looking at a species over a long period of time, we said species basically have three possible outcomes over eons of time. They might go extinct, they could still exist but undergo evolutionary change, so they maybe look different, or maybe even we call them a different species even though they have that consistent gene pool. Or they may undergo speciation and develop new species. So that was looking at a single species. Now if I look at the history of life, though, again, we're going to think much bigger picture here. These types of things, extinction, change, speciation, should be occurring for every species in the history of life. And so if evolution has occurred the way we've described it, then that makes a very specific prediction. Then we would expect to see evidence of all three of these things, extinction, change, and speciation, throughout the history of life. And if that were the case, then what we get is what's called an evolutionary tree, or sometimes it's called a tree of life. So we would expect this evolutionary tree to depict the history of life if evolution has occurred the way we've described it. Let's take a look at this idea of an evolutionary tree. If we think time frame here, past being very, very deep in the ancient past, hundreds of millions of years ago versus today, what we expect to see is this evolutionary tree, or this tree of life. Now, the letters up on top there, A through G, represent current or extant species. The species that exist today, we could go out and study and collect their DNA and so forth. All of the lines below that then are representing species that have existed in the past. Now, many of these lines don't lead up to a species today, and so any of these lines that stop before they get to today, we would say that was an example of our extinction. Notice the lines are going sideways, they're not going straight up and down, and that sideways movement indicates evolutionary change. So while species A may be a really ancient species that's been around a long time, certainly today it may not look or chemically be made up of the same chemicals it was historically in the past. It's undergone that evolutionary change. And then any time that we've got a split in those lines, a fork in our tree, that represents speciation. And so here we can see we've combined our three things, extinction, speciation, and change, except we're looking at a broad group of species. So we would predict this tree of life. Now, if evolution has occurred the way we've described, we would expect this tree of life, and this has very implicit predictions about what we would expect to see when we investigate life's history. And one prediction is that extinction has occurred throughout life's history, that many, many species have gone extinct, regardless of how recent we look or how deep in the past we look. All throughout history, we would expect to see many, many extinctions along the way. And in fact, 99% of all the species that have ever existed on our planet are extinct today. And while we have an incredible diversity of species on our planet today, that represents just a small fraction of the historical diversity that we've seen. And this is just looking at this as an example. This is looking at different extinction rates for different time periods. The farther down we go, the more deep in historic past we go, and we can see consistently throughout time there are species disappearing and going extinct. Again, whether it was 440 million years ago or whether it was 40 million years ago, we see our extinction pattern. A second key prediction about our tree of life is that speciation has occurred throughout life's history. Again, it doesn't matter which time frame we're looking at, we expect to see new species appearing all the way throughout life's history. And then sometimes we might have one of those adaptive radiations that we talked about last time, where we have speciation occurring at a really high rate and we see many new species appearing in a pretty short period of time. And in fact, we do see not only new species appearing, but entire new groups appear, maybe with a novel feature or a new trait that gives them an advantage, and then that trait spreads through a new species very, very quickly. And your book uses cichlids as a good example of speciation. And cichlids, there are literally hundreds of different species of these cichlid fishes in these lakes in eastern Africa. Different lakes may have similar species, so in fact here we see two lakes compared and species that look a lot alike but are genetically distinct and have reproductive barriers. And in fact, even if we just look in one single lake, what we see are many, many species that exist in different habitats. So kind of habitat isolation going on here as a major reproductive barrier. And so we do know that certainly species do appear consistently throughout the history of life. Another key prediction about this tree of life, or evolutionary tree, is that all species are related to each other. And by this, what we mean is if I pick any two species that exist today, theoretically I can trace their ancestry back to a single ancestral species, that all life is related to one another. And we can refer to that as the continuity of life. And we see lots of evidence that all life does share a single common ancestor. The idea that we're, if we look at our evolutionary tree here, whether we're looking at plants or animals or bacteria, that we can all trace our ancestry back. Okay? All living things are composed of cells, is good evidence that we all have that same ancestor at the bottom of our tree. We know DNA is the hereditary material for all living organisms, and in fact, all living things share the exact same genetic code. That universality of the code is good evidence that all living species are related. And if we look at our tree of life here, we can see the archaea down here at the bottom, the bacteria, so those are all of our prokaryotic organisms, and then the bulk of our species represent the eukaryotic organisms made up of our cells that have our own nucleus. In terms of relationship, some species we would say are really close relatives. For example, B and C we would say are close relatives, those species, or maybe species F and G we would say are very close relatives as well. Because if I look at species B and C, or if I look at F and G, what I see is that I find a common ancestor in the recent past. I don't have to go very far back in the past before I find their common genetic link. Now, if I say B and C are close relatives, that doesn't mean B came from C or C came from B. It means if we go back in time, they have a common genetic link. Sort of like if I said your brother is your closest relative. That doesn't mean you came from your brother or your brother came from you. It means if I go back just one generation, I can find your common genetic link, your parents. The same sort of thing here. And close relatives, just like if I was drawing a family tree here, close relatives are going to have lots of similarities when we look at their DNA. They're going to have lots of similarities in physical features and maybe some behavioral features in common. So because B and C are close relatives and their gene pools have only been split for a relatively short period of time, I would expect them to have an awful lot in common with each other. By comparison, other species might be very distant relatives. For example, we would say D and E are related to each other, but they're very distant relatives, because to find the common genetic link between D and E, I have to go very, very deep in ancient past. I have to draw a really long line to connect those two. And so D and E are related, but their gene pools have been isolated or separate from each other for a very, very long time. And so I would expect to see lots of differences accumulate in their DNA, in their physical, their behavioral features. They might have a few things in common, but they're going to have more differences than they have similarities because their gene pools have been split. Again, if we think of the family tree example, I could compare you to some second cousin somewhere maybe you've never met. Maybe you share a great-great-grandmother together. You're going to have a little bit in common in your DNA because you have that distant genetic connection, but you're going to have a lot more differences because your gene pool has been separated for several generations. Our last prediction with the tree of life is not quite as intuitive as the other three, and that's that diversity is increasing through time. If we look at the shape of my tree, notice that if I go deep in the historical past, my tree is very narrow and skinny, and then my tree is gradually getting wider as it goes. So that's our idea of diversity increasing through time. Again, if evolution has occurred the way we've described it, we would expect to see this increasing diversity. That if I go very deep in the ancient past, what I see are only single-celled prokaryotic cells. For example, any rocks over about 2 to 2.2 billion years old and older, the fossils they contain are always single-celled bacteria-like organisms. They may be archaea, we're not really sure, but they have that prokaryotic size and shape to them. Eventually, if I keep going up in my tree of life, I see eukaryotic cells arise. Eventually, I see multicellular life arise. I see whole new groups like the vertebrates, fishes, and then I see amphibians pop up in the fossil record, mammals, birds. I see entire new groups appearing, and so again, we certainly see this increasing diversity throughout time. Now, the study of evolution is absolutely no different than any other aspect of science or biology. In science, we take predictions we make from our hypothesis and we compare that to real-world data by doing experiments or descriptions of nature to try to figure out, is our hypothesis correct or not? And again, evolution certainly is no exception. And based on evolution, as we've just discussed, if it's occurred the way we think it has, as we've described it, we would expect to see these four main predictions occurring: extinction, speciation, relatedness of species, and increasing diversity. And so we can certainly go out in nature and try to design experiments or look at the historical data and see if these predictions do hold up to the real world data. And certainly they do. Many, many different lines of independent evidence. Almost every way we can look at the history of life, we see that these predictions are supported by our idea of evolution, which is why the theory of evolution is a theory. Remember, we don't use that term lightly, theory. We only use it to describe ideas that have been tested by hundreds or thousands of experiments that have been around for decades or centuries worth of time. And so let's take a look at some of the different lines of evidence that do support these predictions that we've made. And again, if we really want to get a good idea about a particular idea, we're not just going to investigate one line of evidence, but we want to look at lots of different lines of evidence to help us recreate the history of life and compare these predictions. And that's what we do when we evaluate any idea, including the theory of evolution. And some of the main lines of evidence that are going to give us information about the history of life and these predictions that we've made include looking at the fossil record, the study of morphology, molecular biology, what's called biogeography, and also some short-term observations. And so we're just going to look at each of these categories. What is the information we can gather in terms of the history of life, and how do they apply to the predictions that we've made? And the fossil record provides us the most information about the history of life, so that's certainly a good place to start. And when looking at the fossil record, it's really staggering how much information is in the fossil record, how much information we can learn about the history of life. It really, truly is remarkable. Millions upon millions of fossils have been discovered and are being studied, certainly, and have been studied worldwide as we gradually piece together the history of life. But we have to keep in mind that making a fossil is an extremely rare event, that when most things die, they don't leave behind a fossil. They're going to be degraded or eaten by bacteria or other scavengers, and there's going to be no record that that organism ever existed. And so knowing that, we have to keep in mind that the fossil record is always going to be incomplete, because many species may have existed and didn't form a fossil. Or even if they formed a fossil, that fossil has to survive in the rock without being melted or worn away by the water and erosion. And then it also has to be up near the surface, where one of us scientists may stumble across it and realize what we have and study it. And so fossilization is very rare, so it's going to give us an incomplete record. But again, when we find fossils, the information we have is really staggering. And what we're looking at here is probably one of the most famous fossils in the world, and that's Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx is the first fossil that linked the birds as descendants of one particular branch of the dinosaurs. And this is from a group of shale that's found in Germany, where we see a lot of detail. And this fossil is only about maybe 10 inches tall. It's a pretty small little organism. And many of these were found in the 1800s, and they were classified as dinosaurs because their bones look like dinosaurs. They have claws on their front feet, their jaws have teeth in their skull, and so on. And so they have very much a dinosaur skeleton. But this particular one, the fossil was formed in a soft, very fine particle which actually fossilized the feathers. So this was our first link with feathers, with dinosaurs, and again leading to birds. Today we have several different examples of different other species that link birds to dinosaurs, so a lot of evidence that that's the case. But here's an organism that died over 200 million years ago, and we can see every single bone in its body. And if we get a microscope out, we can measure and look at every bone and see exactly what this organism and how this organism was made. Again, that's been dead for 200 million years, so truly remarkable, some of the information in our fossil record. But we do have to keep in mind this is an incomplete record. If we look at the fossil record unfolding, and this is showing us our speciation, our change, our extinctions going on here, that while the tree may unfold, what we're really going to see are just bits and pieces. And so we're not going to get all the information with the fossil record. So because of the incomplete nature, we're certainly going to have gaps in the fossil record. We're going to know when certain species existed and what they look like, but we're not going to get a lot of information on relatedness because of those different gaps. In addition, the fossil record does have some biases in terms of what organisms tend to leave behind fossils, and so we're not going to get a completely accurate picture of the different types of organisms. First of all, we're going to have a lot more fossils and more information on recent events, and that just stands to reason. A fossil that's 1 million years old has to form and then survive in the rock 1 million years and end up near the surface for us to find it. That's going to be a lot more likely than a fossil that's 1 billion years old, because a 1 billion-year-old fossil not only has to form, but it has to survive without being eroded away or melted due to volcanic activity or shattered in an earthquake. And on top of that, it has to end up near the surface and not buried beneath 2 miles of soil where we never end up finding it. So we have a lot more fossils on more recent events. We have a lot more information on organisms that live in or near water. And then while there's many ways that fossils can form, the most common has to do with sedimentary rock. And sedimentary rock are the rocks that form in layers, and we see it all the time. If you're driving on an interstate around town, you'll see those different layers of rocks. That's our sedimentary rock. And so, for example, if we think of a lake, as mud gets washed into a lake, it forms layers of mud. If something dies and sinks to the bottom, it gets covered up in that mud. As more and more mud piles up, the weight smashes the bottom layers into rock, and we get our sedimentary rock. So those organisms that live in water are going to be more likely to leave behind fossils. In addition, organisms that have hard parts, like shells or bones or nails or teeth, are going to leave behind fossils much more often, because soft parts like flesh and skin tend to be eaten right away or digested by bacteria and don't leave behind any evidence. And so we've got a lot more information on organisms. For example, if we think marine organisms, we're going to find a lot more fossils of things like gastropods or bivalves like mussels than we are something like a jellyfish, which is going to degrade and disintegrate and very rarely leave us behind a fossil. And here we're just looking at an example of a hypothetical human ancestor and how a fossil might form. And again, most of the time it's associated with water. And so when an organism dies, if it dies on land, it's probably going to be degraded and eaten and not leave behind any record. But in this case, if it happens to die near a body of water like the swamp, or maybe if it dies on land and it gets washed into a river or some other body of water, then it's going to be more likely to leave behind a fossil. So over time, we're going to see the soft parts are going to degrade. That bacteria, again, and other organisms are going to break down the flesh, the muscle, the skin, and that's going to all disappear, just leaving the hard parts. And in humans, that's going to be bones, and our hardest part actually are human teeth. So not surprisingly, the most common human fossil we find are fossilized teeth. Okay? So here we can see that the bones are going to be left behind. Now, while this is going on, every time there's a large rain, it's going to wash silt into the lake. Sand and mud and dirt is continually being deposited in lakes. And as that happens, that's gradually going to cover up the fossil. And as those layers of silt get deeper and deeper and deeper, the weight of the top layers will smash the bottom layers into rock. Calcium will be leached out of the bone, and that will be replaced with other ions that make up the rock, so that that bone then eventually will be turned into a rock fossil. Now, over time, that lake then may dry out. Other layers of rock are going to be deposited on top of that, but millions of years later, new environmental conditions, maybe rain is going to wash and erode away the soil, and that may uncover one of these fossils that are stuck in one of these layers of sedimentary rock. And even today with our high technology, that's the most common way we find fossils, is through just observation. And here we can see this is actually a human femur, a fossilized femur, that's being uncovered by this rainstorm. So in terms of our predictions that we made, our extinction, speciation, relatedness, and increasing diversity, the fossil record gives us a tremendous amount of information about 3 of those predictions: extinctions, speciations, and increasing diversity. And certainly all the evidence that we find in the fossil record supports those predictions exactly as we've made. The one prediction, though, that we can't really address very well with the fossil record is this prediction about relatedness. Because there are so many gaps and the record is incomplete, excuse me, we can't really determine how species are related to each other. So we're going to have to look for at other evidence for this relatedness aspect. And like many topics we've covered this semester in biology, we could spend weeks, if not a whole semester course, just on this one little topic of the fossil record. But we certainly observe lots of species going extinct, many speciation events. If we look at the oldest rocks, they contain the least amount of diversity, single-celled bacteria, for example. And then as we progress from older to younger rocks, we see many new species appear, many extinctions, entire new groups appearing. And this graph just looks at the diversity of life, how many different species we find in the fossil record. And again, the shape of this tree is almost identical to the tree that we predicted with our evolutionary tree, that the farther back we go, the narrower our tree gets. Although we do see with these red lines here 5 major mass extinctions, where a significant amount of species have gone extinct in a short period of time. The last one was the KT mass extinction 65 million years ago. That's the one that did in the dinosaurs. The most severe of all the mass extinction was the end Permian about 240 million years ago, and fully 80% of all the species that existed went extinct in this short period of time. Now, some extinctions may be caused by asteroids. That may be the case with the KT extinction. Others certainly were not. We don't see asteroid impacts for all these time events, and so we're not really sure what causes some of these mass extinctions. A sixth mass extinction certainly may be underway today, and that's a mass extinction that we as humans are causing worldwide, as many, many species have gone extinct in the last 150 to 200 years or so. If we look at the geological time scale from your book, again, it just reiterates what we find in the fossil record, that the deeper in time we go, the more simple organisms we find. As we progress to younger and younger rocks, we see entire new groups appearing. Amphibians appear for the first time in the Devonian, for example. We see plants colonizing land. Eventually we see conifers, the cone-bearing plants. And eventually we see flowering plants pop up about 120 million years ago. And so we see this increasing diversity, new species appearing, lots of extinctions going on. Okay? Now, one warning I want to give you is when we see a chart like this, and your book is no exception, we always see a human sitting at the top of the chart, certainly as we see here. And the reason for that, of course, is, well, we're human and we made the chart, so we get to sit on top. But realize there is no logical sort of progression in evolution, that this is the way life has unfolded because of the processes of natural selection and genetic drift and mutation and all the processes that we've talked about. And the one thing that these charts tend to leave out is that those bacteria that popped up 3 billion years ago, their descendants still exist today, but we don't put them on the chart at every level to keep the chart simple. So be kind of leery of that idea that humans sort of are the end of the progression here, or at the top of the chain. Certainly we're just another species among many species in the history of life. Since our fossil record doesn't give us much information about that prediction of relatedness of species, there's a couple of other areas we can look at for analyzing that prediction. And one has to do with morphology. And if you study morphology, what that means is you're studying the shape, the size, the structure of organisms. For example, a morphologist might study all the human bones and what the different shapes are and where muscles attach on our bones. Or they might study our teeth and our shapes of our teeth and how many teeth an organism has. Or maybe the different cell types we might find in an organism. So morphologists are studying physical features of organisms. And there's two lines of evidence that are going to give us information about relatedness. One are vestigial organs. And you may be aware vestigial organs are organs that if we look at them, they're often very reduced and small in organisms, and they don't appear to have any known function. And our classic example of that is the human appendix. Right? The appendix is a little sac at the end of your small intestine. If it gets inflamed, infected, we can cut it out. You don't have to go on dialysis or any kind of medication. You don't miss it. And so that's an example of a vestigial organ. And certainly that begs the question, why do we have it? Why do we have an appendix? Apparently we have the genes that tell us how to build it. We spend energy to build the appendix, but it doesn't do anything for us. And the answer to this question is simply it represents an historical leftover. We have an appendix because our ancestors had an appendix, species that existed before us. And in fact, in other species, like other primates, like chimpanzees and gorillas, they eat a lot more of plant material in their diet. And plant material is very hard to digest. And at the end of their small intestine, they have a much larger structure that's equivalent to our appendix that's filled with bacteria that helps break down the plant material for them to digest the nutrients. As our diet has shifted to more animal product, it's easier to digest. Our appendix has gradually shrunk and eventually lost its function. And so vestigial organs are really strong evidence of ancestor-descendant relationship, or the relationship between species. There are many examples of vestigial organs, certainly not just humans. For example, snakes have legs and hip bones. They don't stick out. They're very small and reduced, so they're vestigial, but they have them nonetheless. And again, that's evidence that they're related to other four-legged creatures like other reptiles. Dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are mammals, so we would predict dinosaur ancestors should have characteristics of other mammals, like legs and hip bones and leg bones. And sure enough, when we find dinosaur fossils, they do. In fact, here we can look at a dinosaur ancestor, and they were more seal-like. They spent a little bit of time on land, most of their time in the water, and they had these small, reduced pelvic bones and legs that stuck out they used as flippers. Certainly today, modern whales, those hip bones and leg bones have become reduced as the whales spend all their time in the water now, and they're very much more aerodynamic. And so that would be an example of, again, a vestigial organ showing us that ancestor-descendant relationship. Another area of morphology that's going to give evidence of relationship is shared morphology. Oftentimes, if we look at structures externally, they may look really different from one another and have very different functions. But if we look at their internal structure, it's amazing how similar certain structures may be, how intricate and similar these features may be. And a good example of that has to do with forelimbs, front limbs of mammals. Okay? We as humans, our arms are used for grasping and holding on. Cats use their front limbs for walking. Whales use their front flippers for swimming, and bats use theirs for flying. So again, externally, all four of these things look incredibly different, and there's no reason to think that there would be any similarities between these features. But if we look at our skeletons, they're incredibly similar. We all have one humerus, we all have a radius and ulna, and then we all have the carpals, our wrist bones, and then the phalanges, our fingers or our digits. Now, the basic structure is the same for all these organisms. In bats, these bones become very long and thin. In whales, they become very short and fat. And so we certainly see some differences in the basic shapes, but the rudimentary basic plan is the same. Well, there's no reason to think externally that a gripping hand should be built the same way as a flipper or a wing. But the reason they are is strong evidence of relatedness, that all mammals share a common ancestor. That common ancestor had the genes that told it how to build a humerus, a radius and ulna, and carpals and phalanges. And so all of our species are related, so we have that basic plan, but once our species have split and our gene pools have been separated, we've modified that basic plan for different uses. So again, shared morphology is strong evidence of relatedness. Now today, in addition to morphology, we can certainly study molecular biology, which is studying the chemical nature of organisms, looking at things like DNA or proteins. And basically, it's very, very similar to morphology, which we've been studying for hundreds of years, except now we have the technology to look directly at the DNA or the proteins looking for relatedness. And again, our universal genetic code is very strong evidence that all species are related to one another. In addition to that, we do see shared molecular biology between species, just like we see that shared morphology. And this is looking at a cytochrome C protein. And each little pill here represents a different amino acid. And so for humans, for example, we can see our long chain of amino acids for our cytochrome C. And cytochrome C is a metabolic protein that helps us convert sugars into ATP. So it's a protein we find in almost all living organisms. We find it in other primates, we find it in other animals, plants, even bacteria. Well, if we compare our protein cytochrome C to the chimps, we see it's 100% identical. So their cytochrome C has the exact same amino acid structure as ours. If we compare it to something a little farther away, like an insect, what we see are differences accumulate. So the dark circles represent differences, but we do see large stretches that are still similar or conserved. Even if we compare our cytochrome C to a plant, really distant relative, we see more differences accumulate, but we see patches of similarity. And again, this is exactly what we would predict by relatedness, that if we have a close relative like a chimp, we should have a lot in common. If we have a distant relative like a plant, we should have a lot of differences, but there should be a few things in common because they still are related, even if it's a distant relative. And so our molecular biology, again, shows lots of strong evidence of relatedness of species. Another line of evidence that gives us information about these predictions is biogeography. And if you're a biogeographer, what that means is you're going to look at the distribution of organisms. Where do species live today? And oftentimes when we look at these patterns of where species live today, they're really unusual and confusing. And so someone in biogeography is going to try to take into account the history of organisms to try to figure out how did they get where they're at today. And that includes things like taking into account continental drift and the timing of evolution, when species appear, and so on. And again, this is going to help us make sense of some of these unusual distribution. And in terms of continental drift, we know that the continents are on plates and they're moving. We're here in Missouri on the North American plate, and we're headed west about 2 to 2.5 inches per year. Now, obviously, in our lifetime, that's not going to be a big change. But if I'm talking hundreds of millions of years, that's a significant amount of movement if I'm thinking evolutionary history terms. The Pacific plate is moving east much faster, about 4 to 4.5 inches per year. And where those two things collide, that's where we have the San Andreas Fault. That's where we have lots of mountains being pushed up, lots of earthquakes and instability. And so we know the continents are moving around, and of course, as those continents move around, organisms are being moved around on top of them. And a good example of biogeography and giving us evidence of species evolving and when they evolved and where are species of large flightless birds. Things like the ostrich in Africa, or the rhea in South America, or the emu in Australia. These are three distinct species, but they're all very similar. They're large birds. They live in plains or grasslands. They're very fast runners. Their feathers and wings have been reduced, so they're used mostly for cooling. They don't fly anymore. And so we see a lot in common with these birds. Well, why do we see these birds in all these southern continents like Africa, South America, and Australia, even though these continents are all separated by thousands of miles of water? But I don't see any of these large flightless birds in North America or Europe or Asia, which are much closer to South America, for example, if I'm comparing North America or Africa to Asia, and so on. So that's an unusual distribution. So let's take a look. So here are examples of these large flightless birds. These are ostriches in the African plains. Again, very fast runners, but they're not using their wings for flying anymore. The rhea in South America is another example. Here's the rheas that we can see, a pair of them, again, in this very dry grassland type habitat. And if we look to Australia, we'll see the emus as well. And there's a couple of extinct species as well. In Madagascar, which is just off the coast of Africa, there's an extinct bird called the moa. And in fact, there's another extinction that occurred about 10,000 years ago. Here we can see it on New Zealand, just off Australia, the giant elephant bird, which was almost 10 feet tall. So if we look at the distribution of these large flightless birds, again, they're all in the southern hemisphere. South America, Africa, Madagascar, Australia, and New Zealand, if we include these extinct species. Again, that doesn't make sense. How come they're all crossing thousands of miles of oceans but didn't make it to the northern continents? Well, if we go back in time where we see our first evidence of these fossilized birds, when these large flightless birds first appear in the fossil record, the continents were in different places because continents are moving. And the southern continents were all pushed together in one large supercontinent called Gondwana. The northern continents, Europe and Asia, North America, were pushed together into the continent called Laurasia. And in fact, much of North America was underwater at that time. So these large flightless birds didn't move from one continent to another, but they evolved on this southern supercontinent where they could migrate between all these different continents. And then as the continents have gradually moved over time, this has caused allopatric speciation. Remember, speciation with a physical barrier. As the continents gradually separate, that isolates each species of bird, and then we see evolution and reproductive barriers accumulate over time, so that today each species is separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Our last line of evidence are short-term observations. Now, humans have only been studying the history of life and evolution for a couple hundred years, just a blink in the eye in terms of the evolutionary history of our planet. So we're not going to expect to see this entire tree unfolding in such a short period of time. But if evolution is occurring, we should certainly see evidence of this tree. And we see it. We see it with artificial selection, the idea that we as humans can manipulate this natural process for our own use. Again, all of our crops and livestock and most of our pets we've modified over time through artificial selection. But even in nature, we make lots of observations. We've seen lots of examples of evolution in action, and we've gone over several of those examples this unit. We've seen new species appear. We certainly see lots of species go extinct in our recorded human history. So there's lots of evidence of this short-term observation as well. So just to summarize then, if evolution has occurred the way we described, we predict this tree of life or evolutionary tree, which makes four basic predictions: extinction, speciation, relatedness, and increasing diversity. We can look at many different lines of evidence to evaluate these predictions, whether it's the fossil record, morphology, the study of molecular biology, biogeography, or short-term observations. And all these different lines do support those basic predictions, which is why, as biologists, we have a supreme amount of confidence that evolution does represent the way the history of life has unfolded on our planet.